appreciate everyone logging in today. We're really excited today to talk a little bit about supporting mid-level managers. I talk a lot about this across the country, and I can tell you right now, you all know this, that it's an incredibly important but tough position within organizations. You have line staff that you manage and supervise, and then upper level executive staff that tend to offer suggestions and directions within the agency. And your job really is to implement those changes, supporting both sides of an agency. And so it's an incredibly difficult position to be in, but one that's challenging and exciting. And so today's presentation really will talk about 4 key factors around supporting mid-level managers and how they can implement change across organizations. But before we get into the content, I'm going to have Stephanie Garrison and Mike Collins talk a little bit about themselves and introduce themselves and their expertise, and then we'll get started with really diving in. One of the pieces that we would love to see in this is the presentation or the conversation is really supposed to be interactive, and so please use the chat box. We've got about 5 polls coming up as well, and so you'll be able to respond to polls and give us some information about yourself and answer some questions. But then my job will be to kind of manage the webinar chat as well, and to introduce the questions that you pose into kind of our 2 experts with Mike and Stephanie. And so we envision this really to be an hour of conversation and pulling you guys in through a virtual window within the webinar. And so Mike, if you'd take a minute and introduce yourself, and Megan, if you don't mind throwing up the first poll at this point in time around what level of staff or folks on the that are on the call.
Well, hi everybody. Good afternoon. It's just barely afternoon here on the West Coast, but I'm excited to talk with you about something that I think is fairly significant and that many of you will have the benefit of seeing advance further in your careers. So this whole area of organizational change, this whole area of moving our industry forward is resting on the shoulders of the middle parts of our organizations. And what I mean by that is those of us in the middle are the ones that translate concepts, translate strategic vision into action. Without us, they're just dreams. With us and our committed and perspectives on that vision, we can make lots of great things happen in our industry, just like is happening in many others. One of the most exciting things that we have the privilege of working with is this whole area of implementation and how do we move projects forward. So that's a real focus for me as I wrap up my career, about 40 years in the business, either at the county or state level, and the last 10 or so having the privilege of working with lots of organizations like Virginia DJJ that are moving forward and embracing change and really focused on intentional, purposeful energy associated with improving outcomes. And it's great to be able to work with folks like Stephanie. Stephanie, you want to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. I'm from the East Coast. My name is Stephanie Garrison. I am a regional program manager with the Virginia Department of Juvenile Justice, primarily working on the community side of the Department of Juvenile Justice. And I have been charged with working with leadership development. I am the scope manager for a contract that we have with Justice System Partners, and there are several unique opportunities they are providing to us to develop our leadership, specifically middle managers, to support a transformation that we have undergone for the past 4 years. And I'm excited to be here today.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie and Mike. I appreciate that. Megan, if you could throw up the results. There we go. Great timing. So as you can see on the screen, we have about 11% of the folks participating in the call today are executive, around 50%, 46% mid-management. So we have kind of our sweet spot here. Emerging mid-managers or first-line supervisors, 32%, and then a couple of folks that are either line staff or others. So thank you guys very much for participating in that poll, and this will help us gauge kind of the conversations as we move forward.
You know, Brian, that's exciting to see because 3/4 of our participants today have experience in exactly what we're talking about. So I'm excited for them to feel really welcome to bring that experience forward as we're talking about some of these concepts.
Great. And I think one of the really, I think, cool things about mid-managers or tough things within the organization, we all have very similar experiences in that most organizations, especially in the criminal justice space, haven't done a great job of supporting mid-managers, especially early on in their careers. Many of us promoted from a line level staff. We do a great job at the line level and think, oh, well, we see an opportunity for promotion and movement up into an organization. Obviously comes with greater responsibilities, but greater salary generally as well. And so it's a great opportunity. But what we quickly find out is that that job is bigger or different than a line staff. And I think a lot of organizations end up with folks who see themselves as super probation officers or super correctional workers, and that they're trying to do the job through their staff. And one of the things I'm really excited about as we progress in kind of this space of evidence-based practice and delivery of mid-management leadership is this concept that really is that the managers and supervisors are actually professional positions that are designed to support and grow staff, and also, as Mike said earlier, implement strategies and implement strategic plans across the organization. And so today, I think you're going to get a really nice view of kind of 4 core components of what we would envision as an effective agency delivering mid-management work. The first one, creating commitment. And so Mike and Stephanie are going to talk a little bit about how they've done that in Virginia, but in more broader terms as well on how organizations can create commitment and what the importance of that is. The second area that we're going to cover today is implementing practice change. All of us have been in this space for, or if you've been in this space for the last 5 to 10 years, you feel like you're in a whirlwind. Every week there's a new practice or a new strategy being implemented, and we always, for the executives on the call, there's always a scary time when you guys go to presentations or you go to conferences, because we know that you're getting ready to bring some great ideas back. But it's also difficult to continue to implement things throughout. So we're going to talk about what are some strategies around implementing practice change and how not to get change fatigue, and what to do in those situations where you feel your staff are starting to get tired of consistently and growing and expanding. The third one that we believe is really key is leading newly formed teams. Often our work, especially at the individual level, is typically done in silos, and most of our staff operate one-on-one or one-on groups with justice-involved folks or system-involved folks, but often our system hasn't been collaborative in the work at the supervisor, line staff, administrative staff. And so we're going to talk about how mid-level managers can support newly formed teams and develop a collaborative approach to the work. And then the last one I think is really incredibly important is ensuring sustainability. We know that as we bring in programs without energy and without sustainability plans, they tend to die pretty quickly. The first round of training gets implemented, there's a lot of energy, and then it falls off over time and kind of regresses to the mean. And so we're going to talk about strategies and hopefully hear from you guys around your experiences with sustainability as well. And so as we kind of jump into this, Mike's going to lead us in a conversation around creating commitment. I just want to remind you that as you are working and as you're listening to this, please feel free to chat and to create or ask questions or give examples, and I'll weave them throughout the conversation. And this is the time where Megan's going to open a second poll for us. This poll is going to be around how effective is your organization in creating commitment. And so before we really talk about what that is, we'd love for you guys to join in and give us kind of a sense of where your organization is around this concept of commitment.
So, Brian, this area of creating commitment is something that's so close to my heart because I've seen and experienced and lived through so many initiatives that, as you talked about earlier, is full of excitement in the beginning, and there's some really cool training, and we're very excited, but somehow we seem to regress. We move back to the comfortable way of doing things. The very, very strong force of status quo prevails. So when we talk about creating commitment, we're talking about creating long-term commitment, commitment that is shared. And when I talk about shared, I'm talking about a vision that is created and developed at different levels of the agency. And so it's a mutually inclusive process. It's not something that three or four folks get in an office and say, okay, here's our strategic vision for the next period of time. It's something that is viable and can be accomplished within the constraints of the current operating environment. So this whole idea of this shared vision is critical in terms of being able for individuals at all levels of the organization to actually buy in or share that commitment. And what an exciting time it is for our industry. Uh, there's just so much great research, so many great supporters and stakeholders that are committed to helping our industry get better so that we're producing better outcomes. We're making public safety more prominent. We're helping folks that are involved in the system be more capable of leading successful lives. There's never, I believe in the last 40 years at least, there's never been a time in which these things have intersected in a way that we can create that commitment. The other part of this whole creating an environment where commitment is attainable is around this whole concept that we have confidence in our ability to do these changes, to make progress in ways that will be important. Confidence that we individually can learn new skills, and confidence that the organization is going to stay with these as priorities and that these won't blow in the wind as new and different ideas go. So this whole idea of sustainability around creating long-term change begins with creating an environment in which this commitment can be made. Now that third bullet, Brian, is a little bit different in the wording that I think most people would expect. As we move forward, most of our staff, our supervisors, et cetera, are really committed to making the organization successful, really committed to doing the hard work that will result in good outcomes for us. The problem is, as we start introducing changes, there's a process that occurs where we're asking them to do new things. And within that context, as we ask them to do those new things, there's a loss. They're giving up the things that they were competent at. They were giving up the things that they have been rewarded and recognized and reinforced for. And so this whole concept of honoring the losses, normalizing that process is critical for us to be able to recognize and gain commitment as we move forward with these important endeavors. There's lots of examples that are out there. I'd love to see some focus in terms of the chat room, some ideas around how we can honor losses or recognize that that's a normal process, a normal part of the change process. So if
Mike, I think one of the things that you said that I think is really important, that I think sometimes we get, I think we get lost in, is as organizations, what level of commitment, or not what level, but what are we talking about when we're talking about commitment, right? Because I think sometimes we see ourselves committed into a deliverable, right? So someone adopts a evidence-based curriculum, or they adopt a specific practice, and they're committed to that practice. But the truth is, if we start to think about a broader commitment, a commitment to the young people we serve, to promise to do the most effective interventions we possibly can and to shape their lives in the best way, sometimes practices improve. Sometimes we change directions on the deliverables, but that the commitment stays the same. And that's, I think for me, how I've been able to support people changing their interventions, right? And not getting lost in, look, we're always trying to improve. I'd hate to have a doctor's, or a surgeon group tell me that, they've perfected a surgery from 1984 and that they're never adopting new practices, and that new surgeries aren't part of their game. And so can you talk a little bit about what are they committing to in this?
Right. Well, that comes back to that shared vision, which in your analogy, the improved outcomes using new techniques associated with perhaps an old procedure. And in the surgery venue, it's interesting that you would bring that, Brian, because that is the whole healthcare industry is full of examples where evidence-based practices are being implemented on a very regular basis. And that industry has experienced so many of the concerns that we're going to talk about today in terms of the power of the status quo. So when you talk about commitment to this new vision, you're talking about progressing from the standard comfortable set of skills that I can do relatively easily and I can be pretty doggone good at, into a little bit of an area that, oh, wow, wait a minute, I'm not so sure about this. This isn't what I thought I was getting hired to do. Wait a minute, this is really difficult. This is really going to stretch me. And so our willingness to commit not only includes to that big vision, that shared vision, but willingness to work hard in terms of developing those new skills. Now, important for us is that we got to focus on the fact that as we try new things, we may not be very good at it in the very beginning. And to those concerns, to recognize that's part of the process, and to support, reinforce the fact for our superstar players, the folks that are always good at everything, they're going to feel a little bit anxious, and that's okay. That's not resistance. That's a natural desire and a natural outcome from folks that want to be good, are used to being good. And so their willingness to try things out, to not be 100% competent in exactly what it has been that we've done in the past, is part of the process. And oftentimes I've seen in myself, I've said, oh man, this person's resisting. Well, maybe it's more of a lack of preparation than actually resisting. So, I love your analogy.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think recognizing, right, that a shared vision, it may even be bigger than kind of a deliverable or even a mission statement. But thinking about what you just said, a shared vision may be creating a culture where learning is supported, right? And that, I think a lot of times as mid-managers, we get put in positions where we feel like we have to have all the answers and that we can't make a mistake.
Oh, yes.
Right. And I think what's really cool about having a learning model or a learning vision is that it's okay to make mistakes, and that we're, that as an agency, we're accepting those and we're honoring, so even honoring the mistakes, it would be a nice way to phrase that as well.
Right. And recognizing the angst and anxiety of really good people that are faced because they're not as good at this new stuff as they were at the old stuff. Yeah.
One of the things I did in Harris that I think really helped kind of shape this was acknowledging to people that it's okay to fail and actually giving them. So one of the kind of the tools I offered our supervisors was giving staff vouchers to make mistakes. And so when we met with all of our new staff coming on, we would tell them that you have 7,856 vouchers to make mistakes. And that if you screw up or you make a mistake, you just come in, you hand a voucher in, and we'll talk about it. And that looks like you walking in my room and saying, hey, I screwed up, supervisor, here's my voucher. Can we figure out what happened so it doesn't happen again? And as mid-level supervisors, we would love for staff to actually come in our office and tell us that they're struggling versus, what we normally get is people scared to do that. So they hide and block views of their kind of inability or their lack of skills around the job.
Yeah, so nicely said. And another way to say that would be, the perfection, the expectation of perfection that we place on other people or that we place on ourselves, it really can be an enemy towards our willingness to make progress. Recognize that we aren't as good today as we will be tomorrow, but we're better than we were yesterday. And that's the kind of attitude we hope to take. Now, I know we're going to move on, Brian, on a slide, but I just want to bring one critical element.
Megan, why don't you show us the results of our poll around kind of folks' belief of creating commitment? So about 83% of you identified your agency as being somewhat or not at all effective in creating commitment. So I think this leads to a lot of what you were saying, Mike, in that this is an area where as mid-level managers in organizations, we have room to grow.
Yeah, it'd be great, Brian, if we could get folks to use the chat box. Now, I'm going to make one last point on this slide, but I'd love to hear from folks about what has worked or what has helped us make progress in this area of creating the shared commitment. And that last point that I wanted to make was the critical role of the mid-level folks, mid-level managers and first-line supervisors around this concept of quality assurance. And, so often when I talk with folks, we talk about QA and it's, oh yeah, look at the org chart here. We've got a box over here. This is where QA happens, right? Yeah. And the reality is that QA responsibility, that QA capacity to really help drive progress and forward change starts and ends on the supervisor's shoulders. The middle part of the organization is so critical in terms of the frontline quality. And then it goes, it goes to that QA box and it goes through a gizmo, a whole machine where we're able to aggregate data. And then if that supervisor is not using that data, that aggregated data, the macro level perspective on quality, we're missing out, because that helps inform us, that helps inform our staff in terms of moving forward.
No, absolutely. So Mike, you and I have talked a lot about this in general. Stephanie, why don't you jump in here and tell us a little bit about Virginia and how you've seen the organization kind of attached to this commitment concept?
The Virginia Department of Juvenile Justice over the past 4 years has been committed to constant and consistent communication and engaging mid-level managers, line staff, and direct service staff in our transformation, and also providing learning resources and opportunities to develop according to the required best practice changes and evidence-based changes that we have made in our organization. And to give you some examples of that, the initial vision was actually provided to staff by the director. But then the director actually formed transformation teams that were made up of mid-level managers. And the mid-level managers then in turn actually assisted in getting the infrastructure in place so that we could actually engage with staff and having their input and being able to provide opportunities for learning. And over time, we have had several opportunities for learning and engagement. And we have annual leadership summits, and that includes all mid-level managers and line supervisors. We also have quarterly off-site strategic meetings with mid-level managers on the community side that provides an opportunity to review and discuss current and proposed program and practice changes. We have monthly tactical meetings that happen with mid-level managers and the deputy directors, and we discuss project progress and initiatives and discuss critical issues with the implementations that we are going through. And also we have a public information officer, and he has developed several topical newsletters, and it's all in the areas of transformation, and it's providing transparency as to every step and progress that we make in initiatives and implementation. So I think Virginia has did a great job in providing that opportunity. I want to want to give a shout out to Justice System Partners for developing and forming a offering to the department, which is called Justice Transformation Institute. and it's called JTI, and we have all mid-level managers and supervisors involved in that across the agency. And it's providing an opportunity for everyone in our workforce that are in charge, providing the change or actually guiding the change, support to sustain our organizational change through learning new implementation strategy, how to form teams and maintain teams, how to motivate staff. They're receiving coaching, they're receiving insight on their own leadership practices, and they actually have an opportunity to provide a capstone project that actually links with the transformation and gives them an opportunity to actually guide and direct some of the changes.
Yeah, beautiful. Beautiful. And I love one of the chat comments from Autumn. She talks about successive approximations to reinforce as we begin to implement any new change. That is such a cool perspective, because it's going to be perfect. Instead of expecting that folks are going to be performing new stuff at the same level and doing things that they used to do, and we're very, very good at it, we're going to have a little bit of a hitch. We're going to have a little bit of declined performance, but recognizing that that's normal is critical. Yeah.
No, I think that conversation is really cool. And I really see the benefit of commitment. We've had a couple other comments um, around a shared vision and ways to ensure that staff at all levels are pulled into that. I love the conversation around preparing an early conversation so that if there are people seeing potential risks or potential barriers, that we can get those on the table. The other thing I love when you look at project management, and especially around the commitment piece, is really recognizing that that you can plan for some failures, and that having a plan for kind of the worst case scenario and being able to articulate that makes people feel more comfortable as well, instead of kind of chicken with our head cut off if something goes wrong. And so I think in implementation plans, we'll talk a little bit about that in implementing practice change. It's how do organizations, right, again, as we're adopting these kind of principles and moving the needle on effective practices, how do organizations implement that in an effective way that doesn't lose staff, that doesn't feel like the flavor of the month, and that that the pendulum swings every 3 months, given what whatever the latest kind of conference is that the person goes to, or the executive staff goes to. So Mike, Stephanie, tell us a little bit about kind of this concept of implementing practice change. And Megan, if you don't mind throwing up our third poll question. So it's going to be in the same vein as the previous one. How effective would you consider your organization in implementing practice change?
Yeah, so the interesting thing, and the reason that we use the graphic of the bridge, is that as people leave their place of competence to bring on this shared vision that takes the format of new practices and new changes in behavior, for us, it is uncomfortable. It is just really, really difficult, and kind of brings us to that conclusion that change is hard, which is absolutely legitimate. The key here, though, is recognizing and embracing that discomfort in a way that normalizes it. And Brian, I love the way that you so freely use the word failure. A lot of times I've heard folks talk about, we're going to be at a place of decreased performance, or we aren't going to be operating at that same level that we were before. And that, especially from key leaders, key stakeholders, that's critical. And the other part of this is acknowledging that there's some uncertainty. As we leave the shore, using the bridge analysis, and we move out from the shore, we may lose sight of where we were before we have a clear vision of that future destination. And that's a critical area for us to recognize as leaders in the middle. Be nervous. They're going to be uncertain about that. The other part of this is that as we get closer to that distant shore, as we get closer to that destination, things start to evolve. But it's okay in the meantime to say, yeah, I'm a little bit anxious about this new practice, this new change, this whole new focus that we have. And there's some uncertainty in terms of where and when we're actually going to be able to start to feel good again. And that's okay as well. We have to acknowledge that, because if we don't, as the leaders from the middle part of the organization to which most folks are looking, then they're going to be even more anxious about it.
Mike, I think that's a great point in that, right? We think about the shore, and again, I think there's this concept that we're going to get to the other side of the shore, and that someday we're going to reach nirvana and the most effective way to work with kids. And my analogy, or the way I see it, is the experience is the bridge, right? And that the shore on the other side is the most effective practices we can deliver. So I challenge my staff all the time to say, look, we're not going to stay we're going to consistently use best practices to effectively help people get better. And the reality is, in today's world, our technology is growing immensely. We're learning new ways, practices to help people get better every day. And so I think that's hard for folks, that there is this discomfort of change, and that I just got really good at my job in this, and now you're giving me a new thing or a new piece, or you want to bring in this intervention. What would you say to folks, that have kind of that feeling of, okay, not one more new thing?
Well, so there is some growing concern around change fatigue that is legitimate, and calls again for that strategic perspective. The other side of that is, as you talked about, Brian, our industry has advanced so quickly and will advance even quicker in terms of identifying what works. And our willingness, our capacity to embrace new concepts around making our industry better is critical for us to be successful in the future, both on an individual perspective as well as an agency, and we could even extend that to our whole industry. So yeah, this concept of we're leaving one place on one side of the shore and we're crossing the river over the bridge and we're ending up in a new destination is probably a little short-sighted, because the reality is, as soon as we get comfortable in that new destination, it's likely that new research is going to help us identify new practice changes that will drive us into even greater outcomes and more effectiveness.
We're on a perpetual bridge, which is scary to folks, I think.
Well, or a series of bridges, and there may be some waypoints in the middle where we can take a breath and collect ourselves and identify what has worked well, both in terms of the change itself and how we implemented the change. But for me, embracing that discomfort is not an easy thing. But I could see that earlier in my career, if I had been more capable of acknowledging why I felt uncomfortable and legitimizing or normalizing it, it probably would have been much more effective for me personally, as I think it still will be for others.
So Megan, if you flash up the results to the last poll for us real quick, and again, you can see 79%, a few less not at alls, but still a strong majority of folks feel like their organization hasn't really grasped effectively this implementing practice change. And so I, as we talked about with the commitment, I think the same thing's true here.
Yeah, so one thing I saw in the chat box, and thank you for those contributions, Brian, is when we talk about creating these groups that help us with the implementation process. So some folks call them work groups, some call them, and there's a lot of different names for them. But you had talked about cross-sectional, and I wanted to be a little bit more explicit about that. So we're creating a group of in a work group format where there are people from all levels of the organization, so lots of different job classification, and geographically. That's a critical element, especially in a place like Virginia, where you've got such great diversity in terms of orientation and perspective on how we should be embracing these changes. And I would say Virginia has done a really great job of being mindful of that and very intentional So if there's folks out there that are considering creating an implementation change work group, that's a very important factor. Young and old, lots of experience and not so much experience, and from east and north and south and west.
Stephanie, can you talk a little bit about that concept and around practice change and what Virginia's been doing to kind of tame the beast of change fatigue?
Well, in Virginia, we wanted to start with actually surveying our organization's readiness for change. And so we did actually start off with surveying all staff on the community division side as to their readiness to change to evidence-based practices and best practices, so that we could actually have certain categories that we needed to focus in on supporting them through this change. And with the outcome of the survey, we actually worked with justice system partners to design a curriculum that would actually provide the mid-level managers and line staff with an opportunity to explore what that change means for them and how they, at this point, when they actually have are within the work group, how they feel about the change, and exploring different strategies, exploring the models of change, and have an opportunity to openly discuss it across the agency when they're in this large work group. There's also, for us, an opportunity to have coaching sessions, and each person that goes through this curriculum has an opportunity to work with coaches in the justice system partners who have years of experience in the area of change management in the justice system. And so they have individual coaching sessions that give them the opportunity to talk freely about how change is impacting them and the areas that they want to improve in order to affect the change, guide the change, and be impactful in their jobs. And so I think we did a good job with it. I think we actually always struggle with wanting to make sure that everybody is comfortable with change, but that is not always going to be the case. We can only provide the tools and the opportunities for those who actually want to take the opportunity to develop and to improve in their understanding of the change and be a part of the change. And so I would say that Virginia has provided the opportunity, and given those who actually want to engage in improving their understanding of the change, we provided that opportunity.
What's really cool about what you just said is, if you think about it, it's how we develop change plans, even at the individual level for the youth that we serve, right? The first thing you did was assess, right? You assessed your staff where they were. Then you got them together and you created an integrated, individualized plan. You developed a curriculum that gave them skills. And then you provided coaching and support for that work. And so I think that's a really cool concept that I think gets lost when we talk about behavioral change with young people or with individuals, that really it's not about justice involved people taking those steps to change, but it's actually how human behavior works. And that, as supervisors, taking a look at your professional level work, right? And recognizing that your role is not just to deliver a technical product anymore or do a great job with an individual person, but that it's actually to individualize, assess staff skills, their needs as employees of an organization, to create a joint plan of progress, and then ultimately help implement and coach them through that plan. And I think that's really what effective supervision is, especially at the mid-level management.
We gave them the opportunity to do a cost-benefit analysis.
Much of what Stephanie talked about was this area of communication and cascading alignment. Communication up is as critical as communication down. It's so critical that are accessible and willing to hear the perspectives of those that are involved in making the change happen. So yeah, that's and the executive team at Virginia DJJ is top notch in that regard. So Brian, I see you put a couple of things, a couple more things up on the screen. This whole area of lead, learn, apply, teach, lead, apply, teach. We ask folks that are coming into our environment, and Stephanie talked about JTI, to come in through the doorway with the concept that they are going to be teaching. They are going to be teaching folks along the way. From the stuff that we're dealing with in JTI, from the concepts and the strategies associated with JTI. So they enter that room with the idea that they're not only going to be learning or leading with this information, but applying it in their own work group and then teaching it to others. So that helps really adjust, address, expand their perspective as they come in. And then that last bullet, boy, it is absolutely critical that we start this whole process of implementing practice change with this idea that we are going to be measuring. And the key around measuring is not only do we develop mutual milestones, in other words, we have that cross-section on what can we reasonably get done within the amount of time that we have, but do we also stop and look at milestone celebrations. So often we say, boy, we have really struggled getting up this mountain and we haven't reached the pinnacle yet. But maybe we've made quite a bit of progress under some really difficult circumstances. So let's not forget to use that measurement opportunity as a chance for us to celebrate progress. And again, not that final destination exclusively.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about how we lead, or how agencies lead newly formed teams. And so Mike, walk us through a little bit of the content on this and tell us a little bit more about how organizations would do that.
Right. So,
sorry, Mike, as we do that, we're going to have Megan pop up the next poll, which is, again, how effectively is your organization in leading newly formed teams?
Right. So when we say newly formed teams, it's a critical part of the overall strategy of implementation of this whole change perspective. Creating opportunities for cross-sectional communication, for pulling the expertise of our staff from lots of different areas, helps balance the tendency for us to think about, and I'm particularly sensitive to this for an obvious reason, moving into different organizations, I've got to be extremely sensitive that I'm checking my assumptions, that how things operate in my head are the same way that they operate in every other place. And that just isn't true, especially with larger organizations, statewide organizations. So this cross-functional nature is critical to overcoming the dysfunctions of these teams. So that's a really important area. Now, the other part of Lencioni's hierarchy, if you will, is the foundational position of trust. And creating an environment of trust within the organization is something that there's some really cool research. It's still evolving. It's certainly not super solid, but it is something for us to pay attention to in terms of how do we create trust. And so, you know, there's really, and Gallup has worked on some of these things, and some other folks in terms of to be mindful and attentive to some of the factors. So we've got a huge advantage in juvenile justice because these first two areas are so easy for us to talk about, the impact of our work and the meaning of our work. Both of those are critical for folks to be able to commit to an environment in which we're willing to risk, we're willing to try new things, we're willing to admit and acknowledge that we aren't going to be as good as this as we will be tomorrow as we continue to practice and get reinforcement. And so creating that trust is critical. The other three areas is structure and clarity, something that we really should focus on in terms of constant communication, signaling folks, this is the direction we're headed. We're right here now, but we're building the bridge over to this destination, and the reason is to help us focus on improved outcomes. And then another critical area of teams, and this is really important for those of us that are responsible for leading internal teams at the mid-level. How dependable are our teammates? Can we actually have confidence that they're going to commit to do things and then actually deliver in the timeframes and to the quality that we agree is appropriate for our team? And then there's this other area, Brian, of psychological safety. How willing are we to take risks on the team, even when we may not be completely successful, even when we may be placed in a little bit of a vulnerable position as our performance is examined. So that psychological safety is a critical area in terms of developing and overcoming an absence of trust or even distrust and mistrust. So that's our focus as we move forward, and the utility of those 5 dysfunctions is really helpful to bring a dialogue to folks that we can talk about teamwork and what our desired outcome or desired state would be if we looked at how teams operate. And then focus on team tools and the kinds of things that help us manage and communicate. So for example, I think Stephanie mentioned capstones as part of our work with the Justice Transformation Institute folks. Each participant brings a capstone to that experience, a project that incorporates 3 elements: a personal goal around leadership development that is related to that 360 assessment, elements of the JDAI curriculum, and then something that's meaningful for their own work environment. So something that's aligned strategically, that's part of a bigger project. And so using a work plan as an example, as a model to help move those forward is a critical element. The other part of that work plan that's really helpful in terms of the utility of the tool is that it is this wonderful resource for communication, both up to that project sponsor, down to the work team if there is one, and within the organization to other stakeholders internally and even externally.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I want to go back to the creating trust piece and would love to hear kind of Stephanie's perspective. But before we get there, Megan, will you throw up the results of the most recent poll for us? So we've got a little bit more. Folks feel that a little bit more kind of strong. We have no one in the very effective role this range this time, but 23% of you guys identified as being effective with newly formed teams, with 67% somewhat effective.
That's exciting, Brian, because the power of the team, both in terms of relationships and commitment to that shared vision, is that's pretty awesome to see folks.
Really. And I think people are more aware of trust and more aware of the fact that as we start to become more mindful of people's transitions and jobs, I think we become a little bit more attuned to the fact that not everyone knows all the answers, and just because you get promoted doesn't mean you're right all the time. And and so that's why I wanted to ask Stephanie. Right? Is Stephanie? So talk a little bit about how you guys have done this. How have you created this environment of trust in Virginia where people who are expected to know the answers don't have all of them, and developing an environment or a culture that's okay?
Well, in Virginia, we have provided an opportunity for our mid-level managers and line supervisors the opportunity to have to develop their teams with new skills. And those skills are delivered through what we keep talking about, which is Justice Transformation Institute. It actually is providing skill development in as far as for teams, giving them an opportunity to talk about how to build trust, how to motivate staff, and then giving them the opportunity to go back to their perspective units and practice the concepts that have been delivered to them. And then also from a system level, the director has entered into a contract with Justice System Partners, and there are newly formed teams under new deputy directors that are receiving leadership development, team building development through Justice System Partners in individual sessions over the next 5 years. And it's giving these new teams in the community division, the residential division, an opportunity to examine the teams and to actually build team norms and actually decide what type of team they're going to be and the culture that they are going to create for their line staff. Also, the department has created an infrastructure to support teams. And so we have become an evidence-based practice organization. We do have a whole unit that is set up to help us with practice improvement. We have 5 coaches and supervisor, and then a unit manager that actually just devotes all of their work to practice improvement. That's infrastructure support. We have EPICS trainers that have been trained by the University of Cincinnati, and they are also supporting the infrastructure for change in those teams. We have YASI trainers that were trained by our Orbit's partners, and they also are supporting the infrastructure for this new tool, this tool that we want to make sure is perfected throughout our system and that it's used in its fidelity. We also have the department has set up a new division in the training unit, which is a community division focusing solely on intake, probation, and parole. And that unit had not existed for about 10 years. And that focus is very important. It is helping the line supervisors give the staff the support and training that they need so they come back with all the skills that they need. And then the supervisors continue to apply and to teach them in those new skills. And also, we also have as a system, a quality assurance unit. And that's an infrastructure support that is also there for our new teams and our new practice.
Wow, that's a lot. I think your point or that kind of conversation about all the things that Virginia's implemented, it sheds light on this concept that you can't just, right, or reform isn't just adopting an evidence-based practice and plopping it down in the middle, or just creating a training and sending some people somewhere for 8 hours or 40 hours and thinking that you're going to have a transformational process within your organization. That it really does take this broad thinking and development of the organization as well as the skills of the staff. And so I applaud you guys on that work. And,
yes.
And I know it's been a ton of kind of development and developing and resources that you applied. So thank you very much. Our last section is around ensuring sustainability. And so, as all of us know, many of our organizations get a grant to bring in some training. Everyone gets trained in it that possibly can under the grant money. And then that's the last time that someone's gotten trained. Going forward and hope that no one looks behind the curtain. And so Mike's going to talk a little bit about sustainability. Stephanie's going to close us up in this area, and then we're going to wrap it up. So as Mike begins to talk, we're going to have Megan post our last poll, which is around how effective is your organization in sustaining the changes that they're making.
Yeah. So Brian, as you were talking, I was thinking about several conversations actually that I've had with training managers, and there's this little phrase within the training manager arena that's they call it TNP, and it stands for train and pray. And the idea is we can bring people in and we can bring the best trainers in and really go through some great training around new skill adoption, around orientation of why these changes are important, what kinds of outcomes we may be able to anticipate that would demonstrate commitment and progress for us. And then they go back to the same environment, and they go back to a lack of reinforcement. They go back to a lack of structuring and consistent assistance and support. And so we it's the train and pray method of organizational change. And one thing that we can say is that we have quite a bit of experience in that's just not the best way to do it. So when we talk about building structures, I think about something that Stephanie mentioned earlier, and this whole leadership network that has evolved as part of the DJJ environment in Virginia. And so as folks got excited about their transformation plan, they said, hey, we want to be able to mutually support. We want to be able to provide reinforcement and help us create the structure that will support sustainability. So they now have about 160 so of their middle part of the organization that are communicating regularly on initiatives and aspects of initiatives. and setting milestones that are reasonable, that are committed to, and that we can help address slight course changes in the ultimate destination. And then in terms of celebration, you know, one of our viewers shared some information with us, and I want to pull out one part of that, and it's actually agendizing, scheduling, planning a celebration when a milestone is reached. Sometimes those formal recognitions are really incredible, reinforce and propel people into that next zone or the next bridge. Other times it doesn't have to be formal. It can be more spontaneous and maybe even individualized to just a conversation. But celebrate success, but most importantly, celebrate progress. And if we can keep that perspective, I think it really does help us reinforce all the way along the race as opposed to waiting to the finish line.
So, Mike, what you're saying is the 4-to-1 applies to us as well.
You know, I hate to say this, Brian. I don't hate to say it. I'm proud to acknowledge it. So much of what we talk about in terms of program implementation that we do with families and kids works on me.
That's right.
And,
Because
yeah.
and that's the beauty of the work we're doing now. Instead of it being these one-off programs that are designed to change a specific kind of construct behavior, you know, these new evidence-based practices really come from a broader field of implementation, a broader field of evidence that says they're about behavioral change. And that's why I personally am so much more invested in the work we do today, because it's invested in science, or it's
Founded in science. Yep.
In science, right?
Yeah.
Not just some idea that someone had.
Yeah.
Stephanie, can you talk a little bit about how you're going to sustain this kind of this plan and this supervisory, mid-level management training long term?
For Virginia, we have a sustainability plan, and we actually are in the midst of developing a course that actually is using parts of the Justice Transformation Institute and merging that content with the organizational development units training content. And we're going to have in the near future a higher level training that will provide infrastructure to sustain all of the great work that Justice Sister Partners has delivered to us, and to sustain the culture that we have set up in our organization. And I must say, we do celebrate all of our accomplishments. We have had a transformation plan. We have reduced, reformed, and replaced best practices and evidence-based practices. And we celebrate with monetary gifts to all the people that went through our work group, our Justice Transformation Institute. And we celebrate annually at our leadership summits. And we have infrastructure. We have a leadership network, a leadership mentoring program, and we always recognize staff for all of the great accomplishments that they do in newsletters.
Yeah, that's such an important area about Virginia that I think is really noteworthy. Is, boy, they do know how to celebrate. They do know how to celebrate.
We always feed people too.
Thank you for that, Stephanie.
Yes.
Yeah. So some great chat. Is there anything else, Brian, that we should pull out of the chat? Any other?
Nope. I think we're up to date. So if you want to just close us out, and before we turn over to Mike, I want to thank everyone for participating and engaging in the chat, and hopefully this has been incredibly helpful for you around mid-level management.
Yeah, so I'm from Southern California, and today there was a news story about a bunch of surfers that were surprised, astonished, just amazed as they were out sitting on their boards like this guy when the big whale came up from underneath. And it was kind of funny to watch the news video as they all started to scamper as they got scared. The reason that I think this particular picture is helpful is that this whole area of change, of driving change, of leading change, we shouldn't think of it as the whale that just comes as this big shadow and surprises us. 20 years ago, yeah, we didn't have the recognition, we didn't have the capacity to think that implementation is different than program application. But today we have plenty of research, we have plenty of other industries that help lead us to the conclusion that we need to think about implementation, and we need to think about creating environments in which there is trust, in which there is reinforcement, in which the anxiety and angst of folks that we're asking to change, all of that anxiety and angst is normalized, kind of like the big whale is normalized in the ocean. So I just wanted to throw that out and say this really isn't about doing program X or program Y really, really well. This is about adopting a new mindset towards change in which we incorporate the lessons that we've already learned, have learned ourselves or learned from others around how difficult it is to change. It's been great to be with everybody. Thank you for participating. Brian, any concluding remarks?
No, I think we're good. Megan, any closing points from you?
No, thank you all for participating today. Again, we'll make sure that we put the recording up on JDAIconnect for anyone that wasn't able to join us. And keep your eye on the event calendar. We'll be posting more webcasts in our Conference Connected series between now and the end of the year and then going into 2020. And Stephanie, Brian, and Mike, thank you so much.
Thank
Our
you.
pleasure.
For the
Take care.
opportunity.